Rob in Greenwood, California. Hey, Rob, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom, thanks so much for taking my call. Boy, that's an interesting topic you bring up right there, too, but I guess I'll try and stick to the subject that I called originally for. Big fan of yours. I listen to you almost every day. I guess the central point I want to make is that Senator Bernie Sanders, is the only candidate out there that's really discussing socioeconomics in any realistic fashion. You know this just as well as anyone. Yeah. I thank you so much for your support of him. One of the questions I had for you, as a historian, I read your book 2016. I love it. Looking forward to getting the book between the correspondence between Abigail and John. The idea of a large middle class in this country, I contend that it largely was a result. We've never really historically have large middle classes in society. They make a small population. But post-World War II, with FDR's very socially progressive platform and his programs, the working people of America, for the first time really in history, had extra money and security for their lives and were able to gain some semblance of comfort.
Yeah, America was a democratic socialist nation from 1933 until 1981.
Yes, and most people simply recognize themselves as working people. I don't think the idea of, hey, I'm a middle-class person really emerged until post-World War II, when regular Joes finally could buy a home and have a car and have a family.
Right.
But as you have mentioned many times, since Reagan was elected, those programs have been just sliced and diced, and working people are finding out that, hey, maybe the idea of middle class isn't what we were living, because we're all really now one or two paychecks away from poverty. But again, the aristocracy that was in Europe, that was brought over here, you mentioned it in your book, Crash of 2016, the aristocracy of wealth in this country has forever controlled the economics, but they are now, for the first time, gaining complete and total control of the politics as well.
Right. And it's not really the first time. I would say that it also happened in the 1880s and 90s.
Well, and also you can also, I guess, argue that, the Civil War was a war fought against a slave-owning aristocracy in the South. But really, Bernie is the only one bringing this point to the attention of the American people that, look, this wealthy aristocracy is trying to take over completely. And it's so sad to see the complete, almost total media blackout and minimalization of him. Yeah. It seems like... most of the centralized media, they simply trivialize him, they minimalize him, they try and make him out to, like you say, an outsider.
Yeah, well, he is an outsider, and that's why. I mean, Bernie he's an independent. He didn't even join the Democratic Party. He ran in the Democratic primaries in Vermont several times and always won. And then said, okay, now that we've got the Democratic candidate, I'm going to run as an independent.
I think he's been an independent most of his political career, but obviously he has to run on the Democratic ticket to not split it.
Yes, and that's very wise. He doesn't want to be responsible for a Republican being elected.
I agree. But what is your? I wanted to get your thought on that. On the idea of did we have this large middle class because of our educational system, or was it the idea of now working people actually had some security and they could emerge into what might be even lower middle class?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think we have to consider that there were two stages of New Deal middle class generation, as it were, middle class creation, and the first was just for white people. And that was from 1932 until the 1960s. And black GIs coming back from World War II were not eligible, as my father was, to buy a home with a VA loan. In most cases, they couldn't go to college with the GI Bill. And when they could, it was very, very difficult. I mean, basically, what happened was FDR built the white middle class for the first time in the history of the United States, a really solid white middle class. And then Lyndon Johnson came along and said, it's time to bring African Americans into this as well, signed the Civil Rights Act, signed the Voting Rights Act, and started the Great Society, which was a program designed to provide bootstraps to people who didn't have them so they could start pulling themselves up. And the consequence of the Great Society in the 1960s was that in the 1970s and 80s, we saw the emergence of a black middle class in a really substantial way in the United States as well. And now, of course, as 34 years of Reaganism designed to dismantle a middle class of any kind. Yeah. The black middle class was the first to go because it was the most fragile. They had the least, resources and wealth, and then the white middle class started going. And when the white middle class started going, that's when white people started going, hey, wait a minute. and since white people are the majority in this country and control most of the power structures and all of the media, or at least all of the main media, suddenly it's something that we're talking about. Whereas, black people could have told you about this all along. So I think that we need to keep that in mind. But I agree with you, Rob, that Bernie is the only guy who is seriously talking about this. Hillary talks about it in broad strokes, but not so far. I mean, there's still a lot of time in the campaign, but not so far. I haven't heard specific policy prescriptions coming out of her campaign. Although
Bernie's the only one really with a platform.
Well, yeah, so far. I mean, yes. And to a certain extent, the nominee and the party have to do that dance to come up with the platform, because arguably it's the party that comes up with the platform. But, I expect that we'll hear a lot more specifics coming out of Hillary Clinton as time goes on. But on the Republican side, the number of Republicans who are talking about a middle class or working class, elevating the working class is zero. I mean, they're all competing with each other about how they can trash the middle class, how they can cut Social Security, which allows fully a third of seniors right now would be living in poverty if it weren't for Social Security, not being in poverty.
My mom was actually a senior on Social Security disability, and I moved up to her home almost 3 years ago to be her care provider.
Yeah.
And so you know what I'm talking about. She's living right on the edge.
Yeah. So the Republicans are fighting over who can cut Social Security fastest. They put into the House rules on the first day in January of this new Congress of this year a small bomb. They lit the fuse, and the bomb is going to go off in October of next year, just in time for the election, where Social Security disability is going to run out of money, and they're refusing to just do the routine transfer of money
from the various programs.
Right, they're inventing a crisis. I mean, this is Naomi Klein's disaster capitalism on steroids.
Yeah, wonderful lady.
And then the Republicans are fighting over who's going to be the fastest to deregulate the banks, who's going to be the fastest to deregulate the billionaires, who wants to do away with the estate tax. Rand Paul's out there talking about a flat tax. I had an Uber driver the night before last night, but it was Monday night was the Republican panel, right? So it was Monday night. I was driving home from the TV studio in an Uber car, and he was listening on C-SPAN radio to Rand Paul. And Rand Paul started talking about his flat tax, and I made a smart-ass remark sitting in the back seat, and the guy was like, hey, I'm a Rand Paul supporter. And I said, don't you get it that the flat tax is going to raise your taxes and lower the taxes on millionaires? And he's like, no, it's supposed to help it's like, how do you even reason with these people? But anyway, this young guy thought he was a libertarian, right? And doesn't understand econ. But you're right, Rob. Rob, I got to move along. But thank you for the call. Great to hear from you.